Io questo lo lascio. Sbagliato subito.
Sostenibilità.
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 Abbiamo obiettivi concreti da realizzare entro il 2030 per superare la crisi e raggiungere la sostenibilità economica, ambientale e sociale. Ci sono decisioni importanti da prendere.
Adesso.
Subito.
Sostenibilità, è ora di agire. Partecipa al Festival dello Sviluppo Sostenibile 2020 con ASVIS in tutta Italia e online dal 22 settembre all'8 ottobre.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, good afternoon, actually, and welcome to the second part of our meeting, opening the 4th Italian Festival of Sustainable Development. This morning, we thoroughly discussed European policies, domestic policies, aimed at a recovery based on sustainable development. That is what the European Union decided with the agreements made in the month of July. Of course, now these agreements should be implemented, and Italy is required to make a great effort. It's not just a matter of spending the money from the Recovery and Resilience Fund, but the effort mainly requires good planning. So now domestic governments have to draft these recovery and resilience plans, which need to be very detailed. For each project, the impact of that project should be assessed in terms of environmental sustainability, digitalization, and inequality reduction. Moreover, coordination is requested between plans spending EU funds and plans spending domestic resources. Basically, the forms that will be filled in by the government, as it were, are much more complex than we might thought at the very beginning. For instance, for the different action areas, a list of projects should be submitted together with the reforms that are needed in order to implement and support those projects. Also, the different stakeholders should be indicated. It is also required to indicate which coordination efforts will be implemented domestically and regionally, because we know that the funds from the resilience and recovery plans will be allocated to the domestic government, but then the government will have to spend those resources in some areas which might be under the responsibility of the regional governments. So according to the European Commission, also other European funds should be taken into consideration. I'm referring to cohesion funds, the funds for less developed areas, which are under the responsibility of the regions. The regional governments receive the money and they have to spend that money in agreement or in a coordinated fashion with the domestic plans. Also, there are some expense constraints, as President von der Leyen highlighted in her latest speech. 37% of the Next Generation Fund will have to be spent on actions against the climate crisis. So in Italy, 37% of those funds will have to be directed to this goal. Then, of course, we have a big question, and we'll try and tackle this question during our debate this afternoon. Are businesses ready for this transformation? This morning, we heard two cases, two companies, Ferrero and Enel. They have made great efforts and they play a global role. Enel, as the greatest producer of renewable energy, they decided to work on sustainable development. Ferrero is working in a very delicate area, food. We know that food is at the center of many policies, but also many polemics. So two large companies that told us how they are getting ready for this acceleration. In the afternoon, we'll have a number of representatives from companies, and in particular, we will have two parts. We have those who mainly deal with infrastructure, so the real economy, and then we'll have people who are more active on the finance side, one of those sectors that are focusing on sustainable development. In fact, the choices of investors and households are moving towards that pathway. So in the European Union, with the taxonomy of sustainable development, a very important basis was laid along these lines. So once again, the guidelines of the European Union require that the projects submitted by the different member states are classified according to this taxonomy. It will be the first time ever that this taxonomy is used in practice as coordinated at the European level. And discussions are underway, but we will see to what extent the public, but also the private sectors, will be able to take on and use this new classification of investment. But before getting to this panel discussion, we have the pleasure, the honor, and the privilege to have a conversation with two people who have a very broad perspective, view on what is happening internationally. So I'd like to invite Sara Varetto. You're all familiar with her. She's one of the leading reporters in Italy and also abroad. And now we have Vittorio Colao from London, video link from London. Let's see whether the link has been established. Vittorio, hello. We have worked together in the committee that was set up by the government to think of a future. And Vittorio Colao also has international experience. So the first question I'd like to ask you both very openly is whether you see a change in the culture of companies, of capitalism, I might dare say, with the view to this topic of sustainable development. Sarah, you can be the first one. Thank you, Enrico. Thank you for this invitation. Good afternoon to you all. Just a few remarks. I just would like to say that I'm very happy to be here because this is a tough moment, but this tough moment, this crisis has not stopped the Festival of Sustainable Development, and this is very good. And then, after many virtual events, participating in a hybrid event, let's call it this way, I think we will have to get used to this at work, but also when it comes to meetings. It's a pleasure to see people firsthand, to have the opportunity to discuss important topics finally with people, not just from a remote location. There was a moment in the pre-COVID era, as The Economist defined this. There was a very good article on the before BC, before Corona, and then the after Domus, that is, after our life at home, how we've changed. So before, the topic of sustainability became fundamental for all companies. And you mentioned greenwashing, and rightly so. We know that greenwashing is a feature of some sustainability projects which were not actually sustainable, but they were basically some marketing actions. But what has dramatically changed, and one of the most crucial moments was that of the change of finance, when they decided to bring money to sustainable investment. We don't want to quote the famous three letters, the largest investment funds in the world that pushed equity into the sustainable investment area. As a reporter, I have observed these phenomena for a long time. And as a result of the 2008 crisis that affected the financial world, we've seen that goodwill by governments is no longer enough. That is to say, businesses need to play a role, their part, if we really want to achieve SDGs and to respect Paris Agreement. So we need a greater commitment on the part of companies. First of all, because they need to change their business processes, and also in a media company like Sky, it's important to raise awareness in the public opinion. And have you observed a change in the audience? I've seen that there is a growing interest. The interest of the audience has exponentially grown when it comes to climate change, and this is especially true among the youngest people. One of the few movements that took young people to the streets and something that pushed them to leave their couches, as it were, the fight against climate change, the movement promoted by Greta Thunberg, but she was not the only one. Of course, information is now shared through the social media, and it's easier for young people to get organized compared to the past. But the media don't say that there was already a Greta at the time of the first climate conference in Rio in 1992. A teenager at that time went on the podium and she made a very strong and emotional speech. But at that time, without the social media and without the involvement of the media were more interested in what the establishment had to say. That speech did not receive enough echo. And this is also true in the products we provide, our documentary channels, our own news channels. When these topics are discussed, there is a demand for it, there is a strong interest. Sometimes people just want very simple pieces of advice. You know, we are working on our Sky Zero campaign, which was started just before the COVID outbreak. It was about the protection of the oceans. We started in 2017 with ocean rescue. So, you know, the fight against plastics, against disposable plastic products has come back. This is just to say that the role of businesses, of companies, to reach out many consumers is key, especially because there is a greater awareness in consumers. Thank you very much, Vittorio. I'd like to ask you to share your experience as a member of many multinational boards with us. We'd like to understand whether you do see these changes and what is the resistance you see. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very lucky because of my life choices and because of chance. I've always worked for companies which had a little bit more environmental awareness compared to others, and also companies that had these SDGs in mind to some extent. At the beginning, it was a more internal issue. You know, inside the company there was someone who had this awareness, this interest. When I was at Unilever, they decided to focus on sustainability. So at the beginning, it was really an in-house process, which is still true. So the first point I'd like to make is it's important to hire people who have these issues at heart, people who participate in this movement. Then at a certain point, as Sara Veretto said, there was great awareness in customers. Here we need to be very clear. It's not just customers would not be willing to pay more to pick the right company, but it's the business that says, I don't want to be associated with those who have a bad name. So we should remember that the raison d'etre of a company is that of being ethical in its conduct. What are the challenges? We have two sets of challenges as the head of a business. Those who are winning, like Unilever, Vodafone, they do so even though their competitors might not be equally aware. When I was in Vodafone, we implemented a policy for the safety of workers. In Europe, people would understand, but outside, in the rest of the world, they were just looking at us and could not understand. They were just interested in providing jobs. So you need to start, and then the system will adjust to your change. Sometimes it just takes time. With Unilever, once again, we have very ambitious goals when it comes to saving water. But we need to accept that there are things that might take up to 6 years. You know me, Enrico. I think we should be obsessive in measuring the impacts of our actions, because if we don't do that, you might lose heart. So the company leadership is very vital in this change. There are constraints. However, there are leaders who decide to change. So is it a top-down approach for the most part? Yes, it is a top-down kind of approach. I can even share my failures. For instance, at a certain point, I wanted to focus on the batteries and the electronics used electronics at the beginning of the 2000, and then at a certain point I lost focus. That was no longer my priority, and I realized that if you don't check very strictly, people lose focus. Whereas when we wanted to work on safety at work, we were double checking, there were statistics, there were reports, and this very thorough check was key. So my answer is yes, leadership is very important. A question for Sarah. Talking of leadership, cultural and political leadership, sometimes we blame politicians, but it's the ruling class as a whole that make a country advance. When Prime Minister Conte visited Mr. Sanchez welcome Prime Minister Conte with this badge on his lapel, this pin. So, do you think that the politicians are up to this challenge, or they are losing focus? I think that if we move from a private to the public sector, things are very different. I do agree with what Vittorio Colau said. In companies, we need to have a strong commitment on the part of the business leadership, and then it should be embraced with a top-down approach. I'm not just talking of environmental awareness, but inclusion, gender equality, ethnicity. So if on the one side you need to have a very strong commitment, because the whole company should understand that those aspects are as important as the business in itself. If they are able to convey these ideas to all the people, because if we want a sustainability project to work, that project should be shared and supported by all the people working for that company. So an involvement and a transparency process is badly needed, and there again goals should be measurable, so they can create a sense of accountability also against these goals. So if we move to the public sector, the ingredients should more or less be the same. On the one hand, we have an increased awareness in citizens in our country, and we see this among young people, and not only among young people. Then entrepreneurs unfortunately, sometimes we describe this country worse than it actually is. So sometimes we don't remember to publicize the fact that we are the champions in Europe when it comes to circular economy. And this is a concept that is not highlighted as it should. Now, with the premium bill wanted by the European Commission, with the success of many green parties in different member states, and also many ideas to transform the production system, but it is in fact a transformation, and so we do see a change. We do see a strong push, which has not always been embraced by politicians. So that strong sense of urgency coming from the bottom has not always been recorded, as it were. Sometimes we didn't have enough resources. Sometimes we had other priorities. But this is also an opportunity for economic development. A country like Italy, which is already a champion, there are some big companies that are very active in decarbonization, also the commitment of our big energy companies. And perhaps the political sphere should be less shy and do something, especially when we have to implement the recovery fund projects. So we invite politicians to be less shy on this topic, since now we have this extraordinary opportunity. I'd like to ask Vittorio to give us some remarks on Italian companies, perhaps compared to other international companies. Do you think we are lagging behind? And if that's the case, it's just a matter of lagging behind in terms of communication, or is it a combination of different aspects?
Io sono abbastanza d'accordo con non starei a parlare di comandi in questo campo, non starei tanto a dire
I
che le imprese italiane
wouldn't say that Italian companies are lagging behind compared to international companies. Perhaps they communicate a little bit less. Perhaps they focus on substance and perhaps a little bit less on communication, and this is not a positive thing. But to be honest, with the exception of inclusivity, perhaps, I don't think Italy is actually lagging behind in a significant way. Of course, if we talk of a large company, we have to compare with a large organization and so on and so forth. Perhaps there is a gap when it comes to the ability to communicate. And communication is very important because communication is what creates a pull effect, a positive copycat effect. Sometimes I heard my friends telling me, you know, we did this already. I've been doing this for a long time, but I didn't give them this name. And I said, right, now give these things this name, because if you do, it will produce greater effects. So, as you said, circular economy. Of course, Italians have done a lot, but they don't say it, they don't give it the right name. Whereas it is very useful to give it the right name, because then other people will follow. And also, this would avoid the risk that a politician does not take action because he didn't get the right picture. I do believe in the cooperation between the public and the private sectors. The private sector does something, then the public sector might set some rules. So do you believe that non-financial reporting obligations are tools to promote these changes, or are just an annoyance? To be quite honest, they're both. We've always published our non-financial reports irrespective of the obligation. The fact is that when there is an obligation, usually it is very burdensome, too many requirements, and sometimes it has been designed by people who are not very literate in that specific area. So it's an annoyance, it might be an annoyance, but at the same time you have to write things that will help. So at the end of the day, if you do it, results will be produced. When it comes to reporting actions on inclusivity, equal pay, there are indicators that that don't make any sense. They're wrong. We complain about them, but the good thing is that you have to do them, and then so at the end you do something. So you also change the substance. So that's why it's important to cooperate. Sometimes they are too burdensome, but they might be helpful.
Pongo la
Io non dovevo cambiare, ho toccato.
I have the big opportunity to be myself, to put questions to Sara. If I had to recommend something to the political and cultural leadership of Italy in terms of recovery and resilience, what would you recommend? Also to avoid mistakes. Creating virtuous circles. So this is an extraordinary opportunity to create virtuous circles, because this is a huge investment opportunity. You can do so if you think differently from the past. This is essential. I don't want to criticize others projects that were kept in drawers for years. But we now need to think differently in a new way, and this is only possible if different subjects sit across the same table. This is what Vittorio Colao said about inclusion and inclusivity. Too little is being done about inclusivity. Politics, business can only benefit from social inclusion, namely women and diversity, not only ethnic diversity. So I would recommend to take this huge opportunity, because for good or for bad this won't happen again. So if you want to think out of the box to avoid making the same mistakes of the past, we need to choose and select different people to make decisions. I'll be very concise, very brief. I recommend not to fragment investment into too many small projects with a small impact. Likewise, by 2030, Italy will be hit by a new demographic pattern. So, what is the best return for those who are still young in 2030? Those who are 20 or 30 years old now, what do they need in 10 years' time? A job, social security, a healthy environment. Tomorrow, with ANSA, we will broadcast a number of meetings. We interviewed Massimo Barra, and speaking of technology, CEO of Sky Italy, and he said that any newborn now has 50% likelihood to turn 110. So, thinking of young people and the future generations should be taken into account. Italy is making an effort, and the festival is part of this initiative, to shape positively the future of this country. Vittorio Colao and I drafted a plan where we proposed to change the expression strategic infrastructure. Infrastructure helping us to go digital towards a green economy without waiting for too long. And we cannot afford this. I thank Sara Varetto and Vittorio Colao for being with us. And I'm very happy to give the floor to Paola De Micheli, Minister of Transport and Infrastructure. Thank you, Professor Giovannini. I won't bore you. I like discussing with people who are promoting choices and behaviors that are inspired by innovation. At this time in history, the pandemics has further deepened in the public opinion the belief that the present development models are no longer suited to meet the needs of the next generations, both in quantitative and qualitative terms,
perché si corre il rischio di continuare a guidare la macchina del nostro sviluppo guardando lo specchietto retrovisore. Voi sapete che
you cannot drive development by looking back in the mirror. Very dangerous.
Per i quali avete utilizzato la vostra auto. E parlando di auto, ovviamente non posso non partire dal piano che il Ministero delle Infrastrutture e dei
Let me
Trasporti
start with the plan that my ministry prepared in January and put forward in June to the Parliament and to the Council of Ministers. It is called Fast Italy. This plan is inspired by a new approach. Is inspired by criteria in terms of strategic infrastructure that have much to do with sustainability. Just a point, the plan was ready in January but was put forward in June. Why? Infrastructure has to do with mobility and transportation. And for the first time in history, we were involved in a unique experience. Our transport minister generally tries to allow people to move faster, but between February and May, our goal was to prevent people from moving around. So, due to a reason as serious as the pandemics, as a minister, I had to do the opposite. I closed down airports, ports, interregional railway lines. We monitored highways to prevent people from traveling, with a few exceptions. So the previous plan was reviewed. For instance, city mobility. Taking the subway in Milan during the COVID is not the same as before. The Colau committee enormously helped us in calculating flows of travelers in metropolitan cities. We really worked hard to reopen public transport in a safe manner. So what criteria did we employ to choose the infrastructure to fund with 200 million euros in the years to come? Sorry, 200 billion euro. 130 billion euros, by the way, have already been funded by the Italian government. So this paves the way to a different world of transportation. Environmental sustainability was a top priority. Most investment goes to railways. access to railway infrastructure or streetcars is more costly. It takes longer to implement the infrastructure because you need more technologies and the size and extent are much bigger than a street or road project. Yet, the environmental impact on the mobility of goods and people is very high. Railways are also important for harbors, for ports. We also did a simulation exercise for the next 10 years, and we believe that in this way roads will be less congested. Social sustainability means acceptance of local communities and their decisions about infrastructure. For instance, take businesses. Even in the north, many keep asking for more infrastructure. But when infrastructure travels across their regions, they sometimes show a negative attitude. Why? Because people are conservative. Indeed, we are often facing with situations where works are stuck because of political issues caused by local communities or by the continuous change in political majority, political instability. Another criteria is figures. Infrastructure can also help fighting against inequalities. 80% of Italians by 2030 should live less than an hour away from a major railway infrastructure. So we want to give the possibility to 80% of Italians not to spend more than an hour on private transport means, because they should be offered the opportunity to take a train. This is already real just for a minority of Italians. Economic sustainability. While the state, the government receives support from the private sector, in terms of railways and ports, the cost of access to infrastructure is very high, but at the same time costs get lower for travelers relative to private vehicles. This tendency by young people to use private vehicles increasingly less becomes more and more popular. So our choice in environmental, economic and social terms is to connect together East and West, North and South. Because we have inequalities also between the East and the West, in the center of Italy, in the Apennines, and also in the East. Relative to the West, infrastructure is less efficient. So, putting together these criteria, we probably selected the right works to fight against the tyranny of distance. Between Reggio Calabria and Rome, there is the same distance existing between Rome and Turin, but to travel from Rome to Reggio Calabria it takes 2.5 hours more. This is a tyranny because those living in Calabria and in the east of Sicily, they don't have the same opportunities as people living in Alessandria, Asti or Cuneo.
Allora, di fronte al tentativo di combattere la tirannia della distanza c'è un altro pilastro dentro l'Italia.
There is another pillar,
legato alla mobilità urbana.
urban mobility. We allocated over 2.5 billion euros to provide fast transportation means in the cities so that those in the periphery can be so that infrastructure is as interoperable as possible, and people in the periphery, in the suburbs, can reach the center of the city fast. We distributed 2.5 billion euros. If you look at the projects, cities with a very high level of pollution are those that submitted more projects. We bet on integrated transportation. We shouldn't forget, and this is not easy to say, that urban transportation can enhance private vehicles like bicycles. When these vehicles are ridiculed, I smile because in Northern Europe, during the European Council of Transport, ministers have 3 minutes to talk about their strategies, and they always talk about urban transport and their strategies in terms of biking, in terms of infrastructure to protect bikers, and in terms of incentives to ride on a bike. In addition, I thank Minister Gualtieri and Minister Franceschini for signing the plan for the quality of living with me. This plan was funded with over 850 million euros. This plan aims at increasing the number of public housing, residential housing, rebuilding and regenerating neighborhoods. So public spaces, public real estate, private buildings, and the town planning regulations that are partly centralized and partly regional. The plan states that cities with over 60,000 dwellers suffering a very high housing pressure and social problems shall submit plans that can be funded by the ministry. If co-funded by the private sector and by the regions, they can get a higher score. Anyway, their ultimate goal is to functionalize areas, spaces, buildings especially in the suburbs.
adattati immobili di edilizia residenziale pubblica devono essere dotati dei cosiddetti servizi, perché noi abbiamo un tema
In the suburbs, people need more services. There is a lack of services in peripheral areas around the cities. Finally, Europe, our relationship with Europe, with such a powerful road and railway and port plan, without forgetting airports, all'Italia, and the new regulation on competition to give impetus to air traffic. But air traffic is stuck now anyway. As to Europe, we are working on all corridors and the so-called highways of the sea. So we figured out Italy in 2030, the plan provides for a better Italy, with a less costly transportation, particularly for goods, and you can reach all the rest of Europe by 2030. A young person from landing in Fiumicino by train can reach not only the most important cities, but can also take by train a ferry, catch a ferry or another airplane in another airport to reach more European destinations, or the south or the north of Italy by train or by air. So we go for intermodality. So the response from Europe is precisely to build in the next 10 years as much intermodality as possible. So at the same time, we are investing in regulations. Why? There is no fairness without rules. There is no fairness for market operators who enter the transport market using our own infrastructure. There is no possibility to make an infrastructure by exploiting technology unless you have good regulations and plans, high-level plans. This is the goal of the law decree semplificazione. It requires further improvement, but regulations are important to offer areas that the so-called white areas. I still remember a discussion, a heated debate on this. Anyway, we can allow, on one hand, through competition whenever there is the market. On the other, we can guarantee that the government intervention, even initially, allows people to use infrastructure and reach the goal of getting rid of inequalities. At the end of the day, we want to fight against the tyranny of distance. Behind distance, there are so many problems in Italy, north and south, east and west, and that's what we are trying to do right now. Thank you.
Ringrazio la ministra Burcheli per
I thank Minister De Micheli for her intervention and for her passion in facing these issues. Now, we are ready to start our roundtable session. My name is Corrado Chiominto from ANSA. I will chair this debate about infrastructure, finance and innovation. I believe I know why. My newsroom is creating a small portal called ANSA 2030 about sustainability and the 2030 agenda. We have panelists who come from finance in particular, to change. Any company needs major institutions to drive change, but they also need resources. We'll have 7 panelists. So for COVID reasons, the panel will be split into 2 sessions. During the first session, we'll talk about infrastructure and finance. In the second session, we'll talk about financial topics related to sustainability. May I call Beniamino Maltese, Executive Vice President of Costa Crociere and CFO of Costa Crociere, Stefano Pierini, Central Director of Ferrovie, and Giovanni Ronca, Chief Financial Officer of Telecom Italia, of TIM.
Diciamo che la Ministra ci ha spiegato come i cambiamenti che in questo periodo abbiamo vissuto con il Covid.
We have gone through changes lately, and those changes will affect transportation, the transport industry too. Like Costa Crociere. Costa Crociere had a boat in Southeast Asia that was stuck in the Indian Ocean. So what about the future of cruises? It's a pleasure for CFO to discuss about sustainability, development and future projects. I'm very happy to be here today. Our product no longer reflects consumers' needs. We cannot produce it.
We cannot produce it any longer. That's why we have decided to discontinue operations of something that has 8 billion euros investment, 3.5 sales, 27,000 direct employees and 27,000 employees in related businesses. The first thing you do, you fasten a financial seatbelt and then you restart your plan. If it is in contradiction with some assumptions, there again, you ask yourself, what do you have to do? We have to restart because we are a part of a too large system. Today there are 50,000 households that depend on this business, and we've seen categories of related businesses, because when we talk of related services, we talk of so many businesses. Dockyards or ship services. We are a multinational. We operate in 15 countries. So we start from Italian ports with just Italian passengers for the time being, with itineraries that are a way to restart just operationally, but not financially. We don't want to look at our EBITDA at the very beginning. But if we want to create a demand, we have to provide some supply on the market. A supply that does not look at my profit and loss account or my income statement, but at what the customers might want in a couple of years' time. So again, what does my client want to be associated with to go back to what they were before? In 2014, when there were no NGL network in Europe, we ordered the first NGL fueled ships, reducing emissions by 25%. We invested in a company that had 5 million sales, and last year it was 200 billions. And we also invest massively in digitalization because we want our operations not to be perceived as over-tourism, but we want them to create widespread benefits on all the areas that are involved without creating congestion or too much visibility. So we will still crossing the desert, as it were. It's difficult to get to the other shore, but we do see a different standard, and our digital turnaround will be accelerated, because just like after the year 2000 or after terrorist attacks, you clean the previous process and you start again with something that will be a better fit for the global scenario. Okay, the Minister for Transportation talked about the role of Ferrovie, the Italian railways. We know that it will be fundamental. We will use trains a lot, and railways will be used to connect the most distant areas. And if we want all areas in the country to be at a 1 hour's distance from a train station, the total transportation setting will change. First of all, I'm not an engineer, but I'm a person raising money to fund what is needed. Well, we worked in the future as Ferrovia many years ago. I take this opportunity to remind that the most strategic work was our high-speed train systems, when sustainability was not even a factor. So many years ago we used the term underground of Italy or metro of Italy to talk of our high-speed train system. I don't know what is the amortization cost of a ship, but I know that for a train it's 25 years, and you don't know how many years if you want to amortize the railway system. So when we talk of change, it's not easy for us to change the investment policy overnight, but the recipe, the secret, is that we worked ahead of time, including what was new. I might tell you that the team that made a difference for the acceleration we had on sustainable finance, not many people know that Ferrovie is the only issuer of green bonds globally in 95% recyclable rolling stock. So our trains at the end of their life cycle can be almost totally recycled. So considering the goal we had, we wanted to reduce a very costly resource. We wanted to reduce our energy consumption by 25%. So the team consists of engineers of the time who were 33 to 35 years of age. And in the tender procedure, they included clauses giving more scores to those who met these requirements. This changed the way trains are manufactured, and I'm talking of companies such as Siemens, Austin. So the possibility of thinking strategically about the future is not something new. And transportation, the way you see it today and the way it will provide flexibility dates back at least to 2012. I link up to the extraordinary analysis made by the minister before. High-speed systems are not completed. We are talking of the horizontal axis, and this is a showcase of the spreading of sustainability. A few years ago, the Bank for Reconstruction and the investment, the European Investment Bank has just announced an operation, and the money was not given to railways, to Ferrovie, but to the Italian government. And perhaps the first green loan, Italian green loan, was made by the state, because the project is totally sustainable. We are in the right sector. We are an engine for change, and the evolution of the group. In January 2018 we had ANAS, and the system is very integrated. Now, I'm not boring you with all the goals of our green bonds, but for a long time we have believed in creating financial economic value hand in hand with the creation of social value. It's good to hear that creating value is obviously beneficial. I hope everybody understands this. The idea of sustainability should be part of our backbone. Now let's move to another very important infrastructure. During the pandemic, we realized that we cannot live without telecommunications. So thanks to telecommunications, students had continued with e-learning. We worked from home. Perhaps I'm the only one who still went to the office, to the newsroom, but all my colleagues were able to work from home. And of course it was difficult to follow the markets, but thanks to telecommunications and thanks to network access, we were able to overcome the problems of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm asking Giovanni Rosca from team, what can we expect for the future? What are you doing to make Italy smarter in terms of virtual connections? As you said, during those months, the telecommunication sector had to prove it could support the country. That was not a foregone fact. I live in a country, I live in an organization that was very proud. We've been very proud of what we've done. There were those red bands that provided the network service, and the network held despite the increase in traffic. We might provide some figures. Very simply, during the lockdown period, the traffic on the fixed network increased by 80%, which is a very telling figure. But if we compare this to what happened in other countries, in Europe, 40%, we understand in Italy something more happened. The traffic on mobile network increased by 30%. But in most European countries, the traffic on the mobile networks went down. So something very significant happened in Italy. The use of video communication, and we were not very used to it, increased 12-fold. Smart working, e-learning. That is, we observed that some things became disruptively part of our life. So during the pandemic, the network had the capacity to provide what was needed. What happened, and this is very important, and we see it in this sense of urgency when it comes to the single network and digital development, is having the right infrastructure, the infrastructure that can grow. The next 3 to 5 years will be key to bring the country to the right level of technology to tackle the growth opportunities that the resources from the Recovery Fund will contribute to accelerate. But as Sara Barreto said, the theme of inclusivity was very important. So what we have observed is for this thing to be really sustainable, it should be inclusive geographically. So it's important to have the network also in remote areas and to have a more consistent availability of infrastructure throughout the country, which is perhaps the critical element today. And in the lockdown period, we realized that more should be done, and this should be done quicker. Inclusivity is not just about having infrastructure, digging and laying fiber, cables. Inclusivity also means contributing to the infrastructure of information that can educate us how to make the most of digital networks. And this is true for users, but also for service providers, for the government. The English example, in which the digitalization of public administration was very pervasive and strong at the beginning, and it led to a similar habit in businesses to interact with public administration offices. In Italy, the broadband infrastructure is similar to that of other European countries. It's the use of this broadband network that has not reached the right level. E-banking services, 36% of households or people using broadband use e-banking. In Europe, we have 58%, 28% e-commerce versus 50%. 30 versus 62% of people using e-government services. So at the beginning we had the pandemic with the so-called digital renaissance. The idea was to get close to citizens, to explain what the digital is about. There are many ways, but filling in the cultural gap is as important as bringing the fiber to the household. So the challenge in the next 3 years will not only about infrastructure, but it will be also about educating everybody. Yes, I always want to think about young people. In the forums we organized, we had this idea, always having young people in mind, building the future through education, and the ability to communicate means to give them more opportunities, and this is done with infrastructure. I go back to Costa to ask them, are we going to have ships of the future that will make it possible for us to be more environmentally friendly? I think this sector is still growing. I would say yes, there are. Let me make a premise. Tourism is an important social achievement of the past 30 years. We are experiencing a delicate moment, but tourism is the service sector that is growing the most throughout the world. And we will benefit also in Italy. Yesterday I was taking a stroll in Rome, and without tourists we do see that something is missing. But tourists will be back, and this is possible if we establish a partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and the finance community. We see a goal of 2030 with very low emissions, and for us this is a viable option. We have already reduced 25% of emissions, changing our fuel, eliminating heavy fuel. We have sulfur-free fuel. We moved to LNG fuel ships, and we are working on batteries. I think that we will depend on what the automotive industry will develop, but we are sure that something will happen, and much sooner than we can expect. As my colleague said, our ships have a life cycle of 30 years. This is why we have to plan very carefully ahead of time. I started considering that I should write something that our capitalism should be replaced by cautious investment or cautious investing. This rings a bell. Perhaps we have to talk about this world that takes longer. Investment takes longer. So I go back to Ferrovie. CFO, you invest, and we understand that you will work also based on the money that we will receive from Europe to build stronger infrastructure. But do we have also other types of investment to create a more sustainable future? If I describe the group as is today, we have so many different businesses. There is a regulatory framework for different areas, but the colleague said a couple of magic words, as it were. Much of the investment that can be made today, the swap 10-year rate is negative. This is a very good opportunity. Projects that a few years ago were unthinkable, today we have very low interest rates. So this is very important. So we do feel the role of the ECB. Yes, the role of ECB, but the role of all European institutions. When we talk of funds given by all supranational organizations, this is a clear moment in which the synergies of corporate interests and public interests go hand in hand. For the Napoli-Bari, the government took 2 billion, but we need 6 billion. As far as we are concerned, we own lots of property in Milan. The largest railway stations in Milan are ours. Can you imagine a private-public partnership to enhance areas of this kind? If you know the Farini area in Milan, we are talking of a large surface. So, also we are not listed. This is a great advantage because our return on investment does not need to be a two-digit figure. So liability and equity, we try and have a balance between liability and equity because we want profitability, but we want to invest in the best possible way for this social IRR. We understand that finance helps growth and innovation. And I think that is applicable also for a listed company like TIM. The stock is still called Telecom Italia. So we have a CFO again. Do you think investment will make it possible for us to reach new products that will change our life? I know that you've invested a lot on 5G and you were on the forefront. As a group, Telecom Italia and in Brazil invest almost 3 billion euros a year of capex, so it is a very large investor in infrastructure and technology. 5G is and will be a game changer from many perspectives. It's not just the way people call, but how things might be done in a different way. I'll give you an example that is clearly linked to sustainability and an economic sector that is traditional, agriculture. Laying probes and monitoring water waste or water spillage or leakage is estimated to reduce water waste of 60% and reduce the use of pesticides. So 5G is probably not useful to make better telephone calls. The license is very costly, but the implications, the effects on economy is expected to be very high. But that's not enough. I'll give you another example of the things that can be done, going back to inclusivity. 5G is an enabling factor, but it can carry ideas if there are new ideas. So it's important to have new ideas. This is fundamental. And here we go to more financial-oriented ideas. Venture capital. We have set up the first venture capital fund linked to telecommunications, not just telecommunications, but the smart city, fintech. And we want to do that especially, mainly in Italy. It's not that good ideas always originate in Italy, but most resources will cultivate ideas, and this is important for infrastructure. Doesn't change anything. What matters is how people use technology, if they know how to use it. And of course, in order to do, you need to be able to do. That's why you have to educate and train. And then you need to have ideas to apply on a technological platform. We're a bit late, but the minister talked at length, so I wanted to have a third round, but we try not to give it. So I'd like to thank you for being with us, and I think you have made us understand how Italy has changed based on criteria that can make our life better, both in terms of quality of life and quality of the environment. Thank you very much. While waiting for a fourth chair, I'd like to talk to Rossella Moroni, MP. She's online. She's the Vice President of the Commissioner for the Environment at the Lower House. I think she's been with us. Yes, of course.
Volevo chiedere se già vuole tirare delle prime fila, no, del scissimo, delle battute, prima di fare, non voglio rubare spazio
I don't
all'intervento
want
finale, ma chiedere ecco che
I'd like to
sensazione
ask you,
potendo parlare
what was your
di fatto
feeling
uomini della finanza
listening to
nell'infrastrutture,
three financial people
strutture fisiche o
dealing with the infrastructure?
tecnologiche, ecco, che impressione ne ha avuto?
Devo dire che hanno uno scambio molto interessante.
There was a very interesting exchange of ideas because it describes that physical infrastructure is not enough, as very eloquently told by Mr. Ronca. There is also a matter of training, education, how to use infrastructure and what type of infrastructure we need. Of course, the world has changed. And we have to take this into consideration when planning economic activities. And I think it's very interesting that the topic of environmental sustainability is cross-cutting. Believe me, for those who have dealt with environmental sustainability for 2 decades, hearing that CEOs or CFOs do have environmental sustainability in mind is very good news. As Sara Varetta said at the beginning, politicians usually lag behind. When solutions are already on the market. Our country has very good potential. I would like politicians to believe in these opportunities. Perhaps courageous decisions could be taken. The very definition of strategic infrastructure should be revised. That's why I believe that ASBIS Festival is such an important forum because it puts together different people, different skills, different responsibilities. Thank you very much. So let's start from Paolo Calcagnini, the Vice Director General and Chief Business Officer of CDP, Gianfranco Giannini Guassalli, President of the Forum for Sustainable Development, Francesco Giordano, Co-CEO Commercial Banking Western Europe of UniCredit, and Matteo Laterza, Insurance Group General Manager of Unipol. I would start from Calcagnini. I told you that this morning I went to the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. 170 years of history. They've been investing in infrastructure. They invested in railways, post offices, roads. Is there a new role for Cassa Depositi e Prestiti? I know the answer already, but I'm still asking this question so that we can share this with everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, you said a cautious investor. Of course, we are cautious, but more than cautious, we are patient. We have patience. So historically, we are the largest financer of infrastructure in the country. So we have a preferential vantage point. And in the latest industrial plan, we started tackling a number of topics. The energy transition, energy saving, conservation, production of green energy, circular economy. Others are not simple at all. Some needs resulting from large demographic trends, a way to meet the issue of an aging population, so infrastructure to help an aging population. We expect to have more and more people over 100 years of age. So we do need new types of infrastructure. And since we are patient and since we have a long-term perspective, we can provide some solutions. And this is what we're doing, in fact. The same goes for hospitals. Our country has an excellent healthcare sector, which was, for the most part, developed years ago. More than 30% of our hospitals were built more than 30 years ago. 70 years ago, I'm sorry. So a sustainable model needs new infrastructure like remote medicine or other more modern approaches. That's why we need long-term investors which do not expect an immediate economic return, but with a sufficiently long horizon. Also, when assessing our investments, we have included a sustainability assessment. We don't just look at the economic and profile to have a return, but also we included the impact assessment level. That is, we ask ourselves whether the sustainability impact can provide additional elements, and we do that ex post, but especially we do that ex ante. That is, when doing our planning, we ask ourselves, and this is discussed in the different committees, whether the impact in terms of sustainability is enough for us, if we are happy with that. And then a last element has to do with postal saving. This is an instrument that was born sustainable at the very beginning because it is done at a local level. The money that is collected is then reinvested locally, and it is also a product for financial inclusion. It has no hidden costs, and it's a very simple product, so much so that when people ask me, do we still have postal saving? Yes, it is, and it is very good because it is very sustainable. There is a resurge of interest in postal saving, and one of our goals is to describe it even better, because we realized that we had a sustainable product based on financial inclusion that was never described as such. So it is a product that gives you strength and also a great responsibility, because you have many customers, you're accountable to many people. So now I'd like to go to Gianfranco Giannini Guazzaglia from the Forum for Sustainable Development. I read a document of yours recently that for the post-COVID economy relaunch, you have 7 areas of intervention. What do you have in mind? Good afternoon. Let's start from the fact that we are all confronted with something that was unthinkable before. So we have to revise some strategies and to rethink our life. And while rethinking our life, the financial activity is an important component. We talk about multi-stakeholder dialogue, and this is one of the main characteristics of our forum. In our DNA we have this feature. The debate that we hold is so broad that we can explore many areas. First and foremost, we have to debunk some myths, because when we talk of sustainable finance, some people think we do charity. I raise some money, I do good, I help somebody else, but I don't have an economic return. Sustainable finance is something completely different. It gives you an important economic return, and this was proved in a moment in which financial markets recorded a major collapse, especially in the month of March, and all those citizens who invested in sustainable finance found themselves with more resilient instruments which were ready to bounce back when the market recovered. And I'd like to link up to what the CFO of Telecom said about education. One important project we have is educating people about sustainable financial products. So sustainability is an important topic to convey to the general public. And to do that, we need to have skilled people, qualified people. So it is important to train those who will have to convey this message to the general public. Thank you. Now Francesco Giordano is the co-CEO of the Commercial Bank in Western Europe for UniCredit. We all talk about sustainability. This was very well explained. Investing in sustainability makes it possible to have better financial results. So what I'd like to ask you, is sustainability just a cosmetic operation, or can you really become an important driver for change? Can UniCredit really lead change? First of all, thank you for this invitation and for this very challenging question. It's difficult to deal with it in 5 minutes.
Let me follow up what Colau said. The level of attention to these topics has grown exponentially. On the one hand, executives have become more sensitive to these topics. At the same time, pressure came from the markets and from investors, shareholders and investors attached a great deal of importance to this. So the private sector went faster than the public sector. So I share what Colau said. Indeed, if you simply use SETI standards, it gets like Babylon, too much confusion. definitions like disclosure or certain measurements undoubtedly have a specific meaning, but as Colau said, you know, the public opinion sometimes is just too radical, too enthusiastic, so even the way you talk to the public should be well pondered. For instance, sustainability ratings or green ratings are fine, but there is still a long way to go. It takes time. We approved this month a new group policy, a radical policy that stops coal-based business, and by 2028 there will be no use at all of coal. This is a managerial choice. It's costly because you have to give up a share of your business, but when you make this decision, impact should be measured and communicated to the outside world. It's a moral choice for our bank. It is also an economic choice. Molti sono anche i temi che uno dovrebbe toccare, vorrei solo menzionarne un altro. Abbiamo fondato. There are so many topics we can discuss here. For instance, 1 year ago we established a sustainable advisory fund worth 13 billion between Italy, Germany and the rest of Europe. We focused on sustainability. We were lead manager for a green sustainability bond, so we are quite active. We firmly believe in this field. Quite important both for issuers and for investors. Our CFO explained that the criteria characterizing this is pretty clear, but I kind of disagree. The risk of greenwashing is there, so a public-private combination is an evolution, making this more transparent. Much has been done already, but there is still a long way to go. So let's say that the context has changed. All operators will change. Some speak more than make. Matteo La Terza from Unipol, insurance company. The cost of policies during the COVID period dropped. Positive sign from the insurance companies. I'm talking about third-party liability for cars. So how can the insurance industry help sustainable development? Good afternoon. I will try to be very brief. Our clients consider us as a counterpart to talk to. and they demand sustainability, not only in terms of investment. Insurance companies can do plenty of things, three in particular. Number one, innovation and sustainability. By innovation, I mean the use of data and algorithms, AI algorithms, the use of digital tools to lower costs for insurance companies, making products more accessible to clients. Telemedicine is another example. Even by doctors, it was seen as a byproduct of medical practice. During the COVID emergency, telemedicine has boomed. It allows to lower costs and increase the accessibility of service, not only for the insured, but also as a service offered to all. It is also a way to allow local medicine to reach out prospect patients living far away in distant places. I believe that public-private partnerships are needed to escalate telemedicine at the national level. Then, mobility. We are leaders in the automotive industry. We can sell products or, even better, go beyond and make our assets available to others in order to improve the risk profile on the road. How? By making data available we can allow communities to receive information to identify the most dangerous places. Which means more resilience for communities. This is just one way to accomplish this. And finally, investment. Any insurance company should invest more in the long run. We are interested in infrastructure, in investment in infrastructure projects to attract private capital. Not only a return on the investment is needed, but also a standardization of the analytics of investment, like reporting, like transparency and language, to illustrate how an investment is classified, and I believe that the European Union regulations will offer a positive contribution. It's a major opportunity for us to accelerate large-scale sustainability. Public and private capital should join forces to attract private capital. Rules should be very clear. Well, new tools can be employed, like the initiative, the ongoing initiative by CDP. It will be announced within shortly. Now back to Calcagnini. You helped handling liquidity in COVID times. So what else can be done? CDP is an anti-cyclical operator in difficult times. It did happen in the past and still happens today, and we are now better equipped to do so. We can use our own funds or public funds. Patrimonio di rilancio will be a fundamental tool to help Italian businesses. We finance companies to a large extent. We analyze proposals in a long-term perspective. Medium long-term perspectives are important for us. In times of crisis, the market is scared. We don't. We can look beyond the near horizon. The recovery fund will be an opportunity. We will also suggest initiatives, for sure. I spent the morning to understand your tools and the way you use them. You're also helping local entities. So your presentation is quite intriguing. Giannini Guazzaglia, Guazzulli, sorry. What would you like to get? You mention the healthcare system very often. So what about your requests to the government? Taxonomy was mentioned. Taxonomy is the first step because we're not there yet. Pieces are still missing, including tools, PIR, how to guide and channel resources in the best way, not only to gain a return, but also to help Italian savers, Italian investors. So we would like Europe listening more to our needs. When they write rules and regulations, do consider the market. MiFID II is under review. As a market operator, according to MiFID, on the 11th of January, all investors had to sell their assets, and that would have caused a big damage. Rules are important, but behaviors are even more important. When I bought my apartment years ago, waste was thrown in just one container. Everybody knows that now. Everybody knows now that you have to throw paper into a container and food into another. We do the same with finance. Giordano. I was impressed by the fast series of your interventions during the COVID emergency. On the 2nd of March, the first donations to the Civil Protection Office. A couple of days later to the Italian Red Cross and to the Italian hospitals. You sponsored face masks. Now, where are we now in terms of sustainability? Are you investing in other initiatives to face the COVID emergency? Thank you for your question. We think we did a lot of things during the pandemic, thanks to our offices in Shanghai. So at the end of February we got a clear perception of what was going on. We needed to protect colleagues and clients, deploying radical measures. Now, everybody hopes that the second wave will be less severe, and so there is no lockdown. Using big data on payments, we try to interpret accurately the impact of the pandemic, and many industries are suffering heavily, -80, -50% in some cases. If you walk around Rome, you see that hotels are closed, and so on and so forth. PPPs. Well, we worked very well with SACE to issue guarantees. On Saturday morning we used to have breakfast with SACE. We made deals with CDP, with Mediocredito, so 100,000 guarantees, 100,000 collaterals, many long-term guarantees, moratoriums. Well, now we have to look beyond the emergency. Business finance must be seen in terms of financial sustainability. Moratoriums will expire, so a public-private relationship becomes more important than ever. Two more topics important for us: the eco bonus, a complicated yet ambitious product. Eco bonus is a very good, valid tool, instrument. And finally, we promoted social impact banking. Some regions, some Italian regions, will demand for social impact finance. La terza, we had a long conversation yesterday. Insurance companies look at climate change because this has an impact both on companies and on their insured. Yes, exactly. Italy is characterized by insurance coverage, which is quite limited for climate change. The impact of natural disasters, not only earthquake, but wind, hail and others, is more and more important. This is an issue for society, for the economic sustainability of communities, and insurance companies are looking at this. Developing products accessible to as many people as possible is our goal.
Soprattutto quelle più caratterizzate da calamità naturali, è molto importante. Da questo punto di vista bisogna avere la capacità di prevedere
So
e la capacità di prezzare
that's
colpo
why
di
you
fatto
should
questi
predict
rischi.
and
Quindi
price
anche
risks,
l'importanza dei dati, non è un
which is
caso che in
challenging.
Italia, a Bologna, ci sarà il
In
centro europeo
Bologna,
di
the
studi
European Center for
meteorologici
Meteorological Studies will be established. The insurance companies should play a primary role in collaborating with the public sector to make these products grow.
diciamo, le previsioni meteorologiche senza pensare che questo
So
aiuta anche sul settore assicurativo.
every time I listen to the
Allora,
weather forecast, I will
ringrazio
think about
quello che ci avete raccontato,
its
vi faccio
impact on
personale
insurance
il
companies.
tempo, faccio
Thank you
sapere
so
che
much
bravo a
for
ricorrere sui tema
participating. We are running out of time.
interessato ascoltarli e come torno nella mia redazione. Ho la
I go
consapevolezza
back to my newsroom in the awareness then you are doing teamwork. Three or four different companies and the foundation are share the same vision and often work together on projects. Thank you very much. ANSA 2030 will take care of this. Thank you.
Invito a tornare di nuovo sul palco, vi lascio il microfono qua.
The floor to Enrico Giovannini. Thank you so much for this very interesting debate. This is the final act of this long and useful day. I thank Rossella Muroni for accepting to deliver the conclusions for the day. 100,000 views today, a significant number. So the floor to Rossella Muroni. After listening to the various opinions and presentations, what do you think? Thank you, Enrico, for your hospitality. A very interesting afternoon illustrating the potential of Italy. Italy is often criticized. Its talents are rarely praised. The ANSA 2030 portal is a major initiative in terms of information, training and cross-cutting culture across production, cultural, information sectors. We need, Varetto said, more diversity to put together a team. We also need courage and we need to act. It's time to act. Act now. We are lagging behind, culturally speaking. Politics seems to fluctuate between different solutions, whereas when it comes to the fight against climate change and sustainable development, we must be positive. We need a convergence. This should be the right transition assisting firms and businesses in their journey towards a new form of development, but we can't go slowly. In Italy, in line with international agreements, we should create a preferred highway for renewable energy sources, whereas I still hear people talking about CO2 capture or nuclear power. This is not about ideology, it's about courage and decisions. The CEOs who talked today explained what they see abroad. The International Financial Fund, BlackRock, for example, sanctions companies that do not comply with sustainable goals. And we should be proud to do the same. Let's acknowledge our potential and talents. Too often I see this fluctuation between the past and the future, fear of the future. Well, the Colau committee talked about strategic infrastructure. This was not properly illustrated by the media. Energy transition, digitization, protection of the land. These are not limitations, but growth and development horizons. Infrastructure that hold together training, culture, engagement of different industries, environment, society, as two strategic lines of action. Governance. We need more governance in the new world that we try to erect. Transparency, participation are not limitations or restrictions, so they are key success factors. It's a revolution. Circular economy. Well, in a circular economy, users and consumers turn themselves into suppliers of raw materials. If I sort waste properly, I can be rewarded. We had the regional elections yesterday. Many governors, well, all governors were confirmed. The European guidelines underlying the plan for recovery and resilience state that national decisions will need to coordinate with local decisions. Energy for example, is an important topic. So the political picture that comes up shows a government receiving people's support according to service, but how can you avoid conflicts at government level.
Io ho una grande preoccupazione per quanto riguarda, diciamo, il senso di responsabilità che dovrebbe prevalere. È evidente che al di là dell'organizzazione dello Stato che noi ci siamo dati, la battaglia ultima
The
sulla
fight against
legislazione
climate change
sulla regione.
is a
In
collective
Italia
battle.
noi dobbiamo stare uniti e forti nel contesto europeo
We
per
need to
essere
stay
veramente
strong and united to be
io concordo
competitive.
sul fatto che
Hopefully,
il tema ambientale della sostenibilità, e per questo
sustainability
vedo lavorato magari diciamo un po' del politica, ma non importa, perché diciamo, il piano dopo sui temi ambientali deve essere realmente
and environmental sustainability in
che la
particular,
sostenibilità ambientale in qualche maniera nel momento in cui diventa pratica territoriale
as soon as becomes
cioè noi abbiamo
common practice, turns into a habit.
delle risorse
We have local administrations in the northeast that turn waste into resources, but also in Calabria.
C'è un'oggettività della sostenibilità ambientale che dovrebbe metterci al riparo. Questo teoricamente. Poi però, come abbiamo visto sul tema sanitario, anche lì
When it comes to healthcare,
usare la tensione emergenziale per mettersi reciprocamente in difficoltà. Questo sarebbe un grande problema.
people fought against each other, and it's a shame, it's a lost opportunity.
Personalmente non lo penso come sindaco, devo essere sincera. E i grandi temi di sviluppo, c'è ad esempio l'infrastruttura energetica.
The energy infrastructure should be discussed at national and even European level. You can't adopt energy policies that apply only to your own area. So I hope that common sense prevails because it is in Italy's best interest. Good practices have no political value. They are just good practices and should be followed as such. We should be more patriots, green patriots. The Parliament in the upcoming month will discuss the guidelines for the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience. I guess it will also discuss governance, even though this is not detailed in the document. The document focuses on the topics to address rather than the governance system. So I have two questions. You are Vice President of the Environmental Committee. Can you help this debate through your committee? Or do you think that the Parliament in general is growing more mature and can face topics in a more integrated manner? Well, I share your concern. The Ministry of the Environment and as a consequence my committee are often seen as marginal, as supporting actors. That's why I asked to have a dialogue with the other ministries. I also think that Italy needs a ministry for sustainable development.
sorta di competizione che credo molto sciocca, perché invece le culture
It seems like
dovrebbero
people are competing, and this is insane.
credo che naturalmente fino a
Enrico,
quando
as long as
il MIBACT, che è il Ministero dei
MIBACT,
Beni
the Ministry of
Culturali
Cultural
e
Heritage,
Terze, bloccherà gran parte delle energie
blocks
rinnovabili sul territorio, noi non
renewable
riusciremo
energy
quindi a
sources,
prendere
how can
quell'accelerazione
we speed up?
necessaria.
How can we
Probabilmente sarà
accelerate our efforts?
non serio, strutturato, senza dire che qualcuno ha troppe ragione, ma un confronto tra le ragioni e poi trovare una sintesi comune. Per il momento non vedo questo metodo, pur avendolo proposto più volte.
So I have doubts, and I hope I'm wrong.
La domanda provocatoria alla fine e abbiamo ancora un paio di minuti.
We have 2 more minutes to go.
Taglio dei sussidi dannosi all'ambiente, un tema sul
Curbing
quale si è spesa, ma che certamente sarà un tema di
aid
discussione molto
for the
forte,
environment.
nel momento in cui appunto la Commissione europea
The European Commission
governi
asks governments to prepare plans that are in line with European investment and national funds. The Ministry of the Environment put forward a proposal lately that seems to touch upon the environment only, whereas it would be a very good way for businesses to go into sustainable economy and circular economy. What do you think?
Devo dire che il ministro Costa su questo
Minister
si è
Costa
speso molto rispetto, diciamo, agli intenti ed è stato anche duramente attaccato
Was
questo
harshly
perché
criticized.
chi tocca i sussidi ai fossili si brucia in questo paese, abbiamo capito.
People get
Però è necessario, anche
hurt
perché, come dicevi giustamente
when they
te,
try to
nel momento in cui l'Europa mette a
affect
disposizione dei fondi,
fossil
si capisce
aid.
perché noi non dovremmo mettere in
But I don't see
discussione
why we
un
shouldn't
assetto
question
davvero squilibrato.
this
Io ho
very
capito che questa
unbalanced
brevissima esperienza
approach.
politica
In
che alla
my
fine
brief
accetta
political
politica e
experience, I've seen
allocazione di risorse.
that
Si mettono
any
soldi
political
laddove
choice
si
equals
investe
allocation of
realmente e ci si vede
resources.
realmente. Fino a quando noi non toglieremo sussidi alle
We need
attività
to
inquinanti,
eliminate
piano piano riconvertiremo
any
questi fondi
aid
verso sostenibilità, semplicemente non
for
saremo
polluting
credibili.
activities.
Francamente non vedo in questo
But I don't see
possa davvero metterci
who
da parte questa partita. Credo che debba essere
can
uno sforzo di
do
squadra,
this.
una
It
riconoscibilità
should
del
be a
fatto che non è più
teamwork.
rinviabile un
This
attimo
can no longer be postponed. It's good for all. It's the only way to help businesses that in turn help the country overcome the crisis. So, simplification and investment equal credibility. If you believe in sustainable development, the time has come to fund it. Thank you. My one final question, a very short answer. After the referendum, reducing the number of MPs, committees too will have to be reorganized. What about your own committee? Will it stay there? Or are we going to have a committee for sustainable development rather than a ministry? I hope we will have a ministry for sustainable development, a cross-cutting ministry.
Se questo taglio che non ho condiviso nel metodo servirà anche a organizzare
I guess committees will be reorganized, sure, and maybe we could get a ministry in change for it. Committees are redundant, they overlap, So a proper reorganization of decision-making rules can help these problems, solve these problems.
Vengono una catena di regia sulla presidenza del Consiglio dei Ministri e dentro le istituzioni parlamentari.
Why not? We will see what happens. It would be a very positive signal for the country and for businesses that repeat over and over the same things to different committees. So the political action need to be reorganized. Thank you. We have come to the conclusion, to the end of the meeting. I thank you all. Just a few announcements about the next events. Later today, the Piramide Cestia will be lightened with the agenda, with the 2030 agenda, will be lit up. Then we will have the first initiative with the Salone del Libro of Turin. In the next few days, more initiatives will come. Voci sul Futuro will start tomorrow in collaboration with ANSA at noon tomorrow, and then at 2 p.m. on the 25th of September, 5th anniversary of the 2030 agenda at 9 p.m. A concert by Paolo Fresu will be held to celebrate this anniversary. National events are very many. You can find more details on festivaldello-sviluppo-sostenibile.it. Thanks again for staying with us, and I hope all the best and a good Festival of Sustainable Development. Thank you.